Welcome to Life in Sirens, Behind and on the Scene, a podcast by first responders. We're your hosts, Sophie,
Jamie,
and Aubrey.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of any medical institutions, emergency medical services, or healthcare organizations. Patient privacy is a top priority, and all discussions involving real-world emergency situations are de-identified and altered to ensure confidentiality. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional or your local EMS protocols before making any decisions regarding patient care or medical practices. Listener discretion is advised, as some topics may include discussions of real-world emergency situations.
Welcome to another episode of Life and Sirens. On this episode, we'll be talking about calls where we feel like they could have gone a little better, calls where we may have had some regrets, maybe even some guilt. This is, as we always say, we kind of preface all of our episodes with a disclaimer, but we have written down our stories to tell you. We'll be reading them as to protect any patient information. We have changed some things just so we will not be revealing anything that doesn't need to be revealed. Who would like to go first?
Oh, hey!
As everyone stares at Jamie.
Is that gonna be me? All right. Well, mine is gonna be resuscitate before you intubate. So we got called to a residence for shortness of breath, and when we got there, our patient was geriatric and was significantly short of breath. They were cyanotic, minimal air movement. History was about what you'd expect: cardiac issues, respiratory issues. Took a slew of medications. We placed them on high flow O2 with a non-rebreather, and then we moved them to the ambulance. This time, I already knew that I was going to need to take their airway. Mentation was poor. They were unable to follow commands, becoming more lethargic. Once in the ambulance, a full assessment and vitals were done. They were hypotensive, tachycardic, O2 is below 80, a low end tidal. Respiratory rate was like 10 to 12, and respiratory effort was pretty rough. It was minimal. At this time, like looking back, I can pinpoint where my tunnel vision really became a problem. So this patient's presentation at that time just was all respiratory to me. That's all I could see. This was a respiratory failure, and the only thing that was going to help them was a tube. And so I wasn't necessarily wrong. They did need a tube, but they needed other things first, and I failed to recognize those things. So the start of my EMS career, the thought was very much that if you're going to get a tube, you make that decision, you do it now. The problem with that approach is that it fails to acknowledge the other tools that we have. And so to continue the story, I did go through with the RSI. I used ketamine and rock, and it worked pretty well. I was able to pass the tube. We ventilated for about 30 seconds, and then they went to cardiac arrest. The rest of the call was ACLS, H's and T's. There were intermittent periods of ROSC, but we didn't have any meaningful changes. Their time of death was called at the hospital about 30 minutes later. So what I learned from this call looking back is that this patient was already in peri-arrest. There were multiple systems failing, but I only focused on one. The etiology of the respiratory compromise was likely pulmonary edema, but it was secondary to a cardiac cause. Her heart was failing, and I knew it. I just didn't stop to think that maybe this was more important in the moment than establishing this airway. So what do I wish I would have done instead? For starters, resuscitate before you intubate. This patient needed airway support, but ideally that would have been done with an airway adjunct or a BVM. The problem was that they wouldn't tolerate a BVM at that time. It was the limbo between when your patient's in severe respiratory distress, but then they're also panicking. And so you're unable to realistically support ventilation with a BVM. And so I'm not sure if the answer is that we continued with a non-rebreather until maybe they were easier to ventilate with a BVM and it was more tolerable for them. CPAP wasn't an option because their mentation was poor, and we didn't carry a BiPAP. So I'm still not really clear on what like the best possible course of action would have been as far as maintaining the airway, because I think that putting them on a non-rebreather and just kind of waiting until they continue to deteriorate to where we can support ventilation with a BVM doesn't feel like a great answer. But after we kind of did that, one thing that I am pretty clear on is that the next steps should have been to support cardiac output and perfusion to the extent that they would have been able to tolerate an RSI. The only vasopressor that we carried on the ambulance at that time was epi, so an epi drip would have been our next step, which arguably is also not great. It was originally on my list of things to do, but we didn't make it that far. So looking back on that call, I learned that I should have slowed down, taken the entire picture of the patient's presentation in, and not gotten so stuck on the A. And then resuscitate before you intubate can be the difference between a cardiac arrest or not. And so I'm not sure if it would have changed this patient's outcome in the long run. They were pretty far down the tubes. We were already in a peri-arrest situation where not ventilating and not establishing an airway would have led to a cardiac arrest, but also establishing an airway by RSIing clearly did lead to a cardiac arrest. So I don't know if it would have changed our outcome or if we would have ended up in the exact same place working a code in the back of the truck, but I can say that it would have changed how I felt about it. And so what I realized is that focusing on ABC is how we are taught. That is the order. And I think I've realized that maybe that's the order when you first start. And when your licensure can't do anything about someone's perfusion status, focusing on your airway is great when that's a BVM, but maybe don't lump in all of the higher level of care that we can do into that A, because then it starts to be a multi-system event and you need to look at other things. So that is my call that I think I did not do great on. So yeah, that's mine.
I think we talked about this when we went camping. Resuscitate before you intubate. It's kind of like the new golden standard. We are not pressing it too hard, I think, as a standard for some reason, but I think that's a very good example of why we should be. Do you feel like the hospital did anything further that could have changed the outcome?
I don't think so. We kind of stayed in a cardiac arrest state. Like I said, there were periods of intermittent ROSC, but nothing really changed. I think that kind of last kick from the RSI really just kind of dumped her system. It just tanked everything. I don't know that if I would have taken this patient in without an airway established in an attempt to resuscitate while transporting, that hospital would not have immediately RSI'd her.
I agree. I mean, we were already
Right.
peri-arrest, and that's...
So I'm not quite sure if their actions really would have been that different. I think that it's very plausible that either direction would have led to a cardiac arrest. I just think that best practice now is so clearly resuscitate before you intubate.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, especially for any listeners who are not in the field or don't have a licensure, like Jamie's a critical care paramedic. It is so much to be thinking of all the critical care interventions that could benefit this patient while they're actively decompensating, while we're peri-arrest, semi-alone, outside of a hospital. So I think there's so much to consider and think about while you're trying to put out fires. So I think I can't say that I would have done much differently other than remind ourselves to resuscitate first.
I also think that it is interesting to think about a paramedic's actions in the field, where when you are actively thinking through what is going to be the course of care for this patient, what do I need to do, where do I start, where is it going to end, how am I going to approach this, you are also performing interventions. So there is no stepping back, looking at your patient and being able to think through things while your staff does X, Y, and Z and establishes the lines and all of those things.
And gets labs and gets x-rays and they go to CT. You have a cardiac monitor and a glucometer.
And you're the one doing all of those things while you're also trying to think. And so it's very much like a split brain moment where you have to have a higher, more critical level of thought, but you also have to be very focused on physical action. And I think that we sometimes don't talk about how to be able to split your brain into both action and thought on two very different levels is a skill that is, I don't feel like a skill that we talk about a whole lot.
Action, thought, and input.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out the logistics of the scene. You have to be able to get that patient to a position where you can even start to do interventions. So each call has 3 distinct time periods, I guess is a good way to say that. You have the scene where you have to figure out how to even get them to where you need to go. Then you have to get in the truck, and then you have to think about the course of care and the treatments, and then you have to execute those treatments.
Yeah.
It is crazy. It is a wide skill set.
I know. I think we forget when you get to a higher licensure level that you're still responsible for every level of licensure below yours. And in a lot of other fields of medicine, when you get to a higher licensure level, somebody else becomes responsible for the licensure levels below you.
Yeah.
But we still have to do all of it.
That's
So it
something
is
I'm going
weird.
to talk about
Yeah.
in mine.
Yeah, it's a weird...
The responsibility is significant.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird concept.
I think that our governing body for paramedicine doesn't always take that into consideration.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that we were doing some of the most impossible things. I don't like, it blows my mind. Just sitting here talking about this before this episode made me really realize how wild it is and how incredible it is, the things that we are doing. I'm not trying to toot our own horn, but like, guys, we do some wild stuff with very limited tools, very limited assessment, and people are actively dying. And sometimes people are actively trying to harm us while our patients are actively dying.
Sometimes your actively dying patient is the one that is trying to harm you.
Right.
Because they are panicking, because they're hypoxic, they're suffocating. They are in the midst of like a true fight or flight.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you are not recognized as help, because some things that we have to do in order to help you is actually pretty uncomfy. And so, I mean, even think about like trying to carry these patients out of the home and they fight you the whole way because you have to put them in a position that's not comfortable or is harder. Like sometimes it is. You have to fight them to help them.
The level of decision-making capacity, the level of like, I don't know, mental fatigue that goes on. Just, we might sleep all night during shift, but I always go home exhausted. Loved every minute of it, usually. But like, I think we sometimes take for granted how much our minds are working, even when it doesn't feel like it while we're on shift. And I think for anybody out there who has had tough calls and maybe has some guilt or regrets, despite doing everything maybe to the best of your abilities, remember, like, give yourself some grace, because this is wild that we're even doing this job at all.
Yeah. And if you ever deal with the like dilemma of I feel bad, but I think I did everything right, just remember that like I've had problems where I've followed every ounce of a protocol to a T, but it still didn't feel good. I was like, I just feel like there's a better way. And just remember that sometimes you are mandated under certain protocols to do certain things that you don't feel great about. Like we live for the big calls. We live for like the traumatic, hard, big-brained calls. That doesn't mean you don't take it home with you. Like I love a shift where we do a lot of really hard things. And then I think about those hard things for a long time afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like calls like this where I'm like, I will never forget the way that felt, where I was like, I should have resuscitated first. But that makes you a better provider in the end. But just because you think about it doesn't mean that this isn't the job for you.
I love that.
It actually
for saying
probably means that it is.
Yeah, if you're willing to put that much mental energy into it, you're probably going to be pretty good at this.
Probably all right.
For 24 hours a day. Everybody has your phone number and you can't
say no.
Can't
Wild.
say no. Aubrey, are you going to say no if I ask you to read yours?
I will not. So before I tell you my story, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on me. I'm naturally pretty laid back, and I've had the beautiful, wonderful experience of working with a partner who is very good at scene management. She's sitting right next to me, so I have to say that. And I do mean very good at scene management in every meaning of that phrase, like to the point where I have never really had to be good at it for myself. So when I went to medic school, I knew that scene management was going to be one of my biggest obstacles to overcome. I remember doing my preceptor rides and my preceptor asking me, you know, like, what skills do you want to work on? And I would just be like, scene management. Please give me weird scenarios where I have to give you like abnormal answers to it. And he would be like, what? Flash forward about 9 months post-medic school, and we get dispatched to a significant trauma where the patient was unresponsive and needed to be intubated. We had called for medical air to come intercept. We had the patient in our ambulance. We were mid-RSI procedure when air medical arrived. No one made definitive remarks on who was taking lead on the call, which led to a lot of unnecessary confusion. Essentially, 3 people were trying to lead the call and proceed with the intubation attempt, which resulted in a failed intubation attempt. That patient got onto the aircraft and with all the critical interventions in place, and I came back to our truck feeling like a failure. And I still feel like I failed that call. Not necessarily because of the failed intubation attempt, but because it was absolutely my responsibility to make clear roles and responsibilities. Shout out to the AHA. And I failed to do that. It's hard looking at somebody with a higher licensure and feel like you're telling them what to do, whether it be interagency or not. But to once again quote Chris Smith, to be unclear is to be unkind. And if it is in the best interest of your patient, being concerned about stepping on toes or being too bossy is truly an injustice to your patient, and honestly, unkind to the humans that you're working beside. This is something that I am continually working on and probably will have to actively work on for the rest of my career. But after that call, I can without a doubt tell you, the feeling in the moment of being too direct far outweighs the guilt of not doing your best.
I think that you probably did way better than you think you did. Actually, I know you did because Jamie was there.
I know that you hold a lot of that burden because that was your call, but none of us really did that. Austin didn't do it. I didn't do it. In the same regard that Austin and I both saw that happening, and we didn't make clear roles or responsibilities either because we also didn't want to step on toes.
Yeah, but I think that is the part that bothers me the most about that, because I was in a situation where it was very clear that I felt pressure, unnecessary pressure, and it was my call, and I was lead on that call, and I had every right in the world, and I felt that I needed to say something, do something, and I didn't. And I think that's what still bothers me so much about that. Not necessarily that because there wasn't a bad outcome or that things went terribly, horribly wrong or anything was set on fire. I think it's because I know that I struggle with that, and that was almost like a test.
It was like an opportunity.
And I failed. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that call has weighed heavily on me.
I understand that. I also think that was the first really good example we've had. It was so stark of this was your scene to manage.
Yeah.
Because I think we've had other calls that were high acuity like that, but they've honestly been kind of spread out into multiple scenes. They've been high acuity wrecks or instances where we're both kind of off in our own, managing our own baby scene. And so I think that this was the first time that we were actually all in the same truck.
Yeah.
Together, all just kind of staring at each other, being like, who's gonna do it?
A lot of paramedics.
And to technically be the lowest level on that call, but also be the one in charge. That is a hard dynamic.
Yeah, it was strange.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the only thing that situation needed was really just one sentence. All I needed to do was ask, would you like me to continue with this procedure, or would you like to take over patient care at this time? That's really all that needed to be done, and I didn't do that. There just needed to be a clear course of action provided.
I also think it is worth noting that we have not often found ourselves in that situation with an air crew where they did not come in very clear.
And hand off to any agency, whether it be another EMS agency, an air crew, or a hospital. I feel like some of the most tense moments, especially the more critical your patient is, happen in those scenarios because of lack of communication.
Yeah. Communication is key. No big deal. Nothing new.
Send them to talk therapy. I don't know.
Yes. And you do not need a high level of licensure to be a good communicator. You can be the babiest license on that call. You could be an EMTB for the fire department.
You can just listen to our podcast.
Right? And if you're a good communicator, be like, I feel like roles are unclear.
Yeah.
Well, so, what do you have?
Mine is also, mine seems lame compared to y'all's. Here's what I got.
All right, let's see.
So it was the scene of an MVA. It was a multi-car MVA. There were already several fire crews on scene. There were several vehicles, but there was only one car that sustained significant damage and required extrication being performed on it. So it was one of those scenes when we arrived. There's debris all over the roadway. There's firefighters scattered around carrying equipment. It's noisy. It was just very uneasy feeling. I was a new medic. I was already overwhelmed. I was with a new EMT partner. I was the first on scene for EMS. I was not ready for what I was about to get into. So we quickly located a critically injured child who had been found in another part of the vehicle that they were first started in. So they were in their car seat, but the car seat was not restrained, but they were restrained in their car seat. So the car seat and the child were found in another part of the vehicle. And I've worked in peds for many years, but it's still something that just, it gets all of us. So I poured a lot of my attention into this critically injured child. I definitely had tunnel vision at this point. My concern was stabilizing this child who was, on our arrival, unresponsive. The vulnerability of child trauma is just a whole other situation, and I was already angry because I knew that this may not have ended up the way it was if this child was appropriately restrained. So I was angry. I was overwhelmed. It was a busy scene, and I was the only paramedic there, really. And there was another person who was seriously injured at the time. They were the driver of the vehicle, and were being extricated, and I trusted when fire said, "They're fine. We've got him." I just said, "Okay, you're right. I believe you." And that's my deepest regret on this call, and we'll get into that in just a second. So in focusing so intently on this child, I completely, again, like I said, overlooked the driver, the adult patient, who was still seated in the vehicle. The driver was conscious, but had significant injuries that didn't initially present to me as life-threatening because I did not do an assessment. And they ended up lower on my mental priority list. While I was focused on the pediatric patient, the fire department assessed and treated the driver. Once the child was stabilized, we began transporting emergency traffic to the trauma center. While there was already another EMS unit on scene by our time of transport, I did not know how critical the driver was. It wasn't until we were already en route that the second EMS unit called for air medical. Their assessment revealed critical internal injuries and now an unresponsive driver. They did end up flying the patient. This patient did arrest in the air. Air had to divert. Again, I was just so hyper-focused on this child, which the child did live. I also have a lot of regrets about not flying this child also, because this child was very critically injured. But we all know that there's like this mentality, especially in our system, that we experience, that it's almost like, I don't know, there's like a stigma around flying patients because we are about 30 minutes to the largest city, which has a trauma center. So for me, it was just a systemic failure. I didn't assess the patient because I trusted that, and there was a paramedic with this patient, but it was a firefighter paramedic that did not have all the equipment that we have on an ambulance. They did not work with us. I just trusted what they said, and I knew another unit was coming, and I said, you know what, it'll be fine because I'm worried about this kid. And, I mean, I'm only with an EMT, so I was like, you know what, they can't just go be with this kid by themselves. I'll just go be with the kid, and I didn't even instruct my EMT to go check on this driver, who I did trust to do an assessment. That was going to be something that I could go off of, and potentially I could have called for air in a timely manner that maybe could have changed the outcome. Whether that is true or not, I still have a lot of regret about this call, and I think about it all the freaking time. It was just kind of like one of those sobering reminders that we have to, remain super vigilant and maintain our scene and make sure we are assessing everyone, even though there's a ton of moving parts on these scenes a lot of the time. I wish I could do it over again.
Yeah. I think you are experiencing, our director of education said this the other day. He said, trust but verify. And I think that this is the trust but verify phenomenon.
Which, and potentially, like we all know, when we extricate patients and they become
worse,
unentrapped, they become unstable. Which, after this call, we talked to this crew, and that very much does seem what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this patient was stable until they weren't. So I don't know that my assessment would have made a total change of the game, but maybe it would have. Who knows? Like, I don't know.
It at the very least sounds like it may have given you, what word am I looking for?
At least some
Like
comfort
the
or closure.
Yeah, it would have given you some resolve that, like, when I also assessed this patient,
They were
they
stable.
were stable.
Yeah.
And I did a full assessment to the best of my ability within the situation they were in, and I agreed with the fire medic on scene that they were stable. I think having not done that, that's where the gap of regret lives.
Right.
Is like, because I don't know. Maybe I would have seen that they had huge abdominal trauma or whatever it was. Like, maybe I would have seen those signs and called for error.
Right. And maybe I still wouldn't have recognized those things as a baby medic, but I don't know. And the crew and the supervisor arrived on the scene before the crew did, and they were like, oh yeah, they're fine, like, we'll just let the next crew handle it. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start transporting this very critical child by ground to the level 1 trauma center. And I don't know, it just was really, really crappy to hear on the radio while I'm transporting that they're calling for air.
Yeah. I would say, I completely understand, and I probably would have done the exact same thing. I will say that the human, like the humanity part of this, is that I'm sure that that parent is very grateful that you got tunnel vision and took care of their kid instead.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm sure that that parent would have had it no other way. So I think that there is value in, like, thinking about not just the medical side that we think about a lot, but like the humanity side of it. And I don't know one parent in our life that would be like, I wish that medic would have paid more attention to me than my baby. And sometimes that comes down to accessibility. You can get the kid out,
Right.
Yeah.
but it was taking a significant longer amount of time to get the parent out.
Right.
And so sometimes that's the factor. It's not even who's more critical, it's who can you get to,
Right.
you know? But I agree.
Never do it again. I go to, it could be the lowest acuity in VA. I go to every single vehicle. I can't not.
Yeah, once it happens to you once,
Absolutely.
I am auto-launching air, and I am canceling them if I don't need them, and I will not be caught then again.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. You're going on a ride.
Do you think that the flight crew would have done any different interventions for the kid that you had than you did?
Probably would have earned an RSI.
Okay. So probably would have established an airway.
Probably would have established an airway.
Do you think the child had a negative outcome having not established an airway?
No, I don't. The child was initially unresponsive. GCS did improve. Still was GCS low enough to justify an RSI, but was maintaining their airway enough where I feel like there was no detriment at all.
Good.
I think possibly this child could have benefited from some blood products.
Okay.
We were trending hypotensive, but we were not gravely hypotensive. So,
Yeah, those are tough calls to make too, because even if you did have access or did think through like the access to air on that call, I would argue that getting to definitive care for those interventions may have been more beneficial in the long run, because to have a pediatric trauma center be the ones to establish that airway, because it's not even about ability, it's about practice. You know, and so to be the ones to establish that airway and to initiate any kind of hemodynamic control or improvement, it may have been the best case scenario. Because even though flight they deal with more kids than we do, often, they still aren't like
yeah,
pediatric,
exactly.
you know, providers. So I think you can go both ways, but sometimes definitive care really is the best option.
Right. I was just really, I guess I really got tunnel vision because of this mental status.
Which is fair.
That really freaked me out. This is the only child I had ever boarded ever.
Yeah.
Still.
Did you use an adult board or a tiny board?
Tiny board.
You had a tiny board?
Tiny board.
Which they're so much better because there's ours at our service, they're soft. So like the back part of the board, I mean it's a rigid board, but it's like padded.
Yeah.
So, but I was like, I don't feel good about this. This
Yeah.
is yucky feeling.
For sure.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I don't like having to pick who who gets the first ride. I don't like that. And that's
Mhm.
kind of how it went. Which, I mean, logically, this person was still being extricated, whatever. But it just feels weird when you do stuff like that.
Yes. I don't like not knowing what is happening on what is technically my scene.
Absolutely.
Like, I just want to know. I feel like I've failed to some degree if there are things happening that I don't know about.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if I maybe wouldn't have been able to change the outcome, I just feel like I'm supposed to know about it.
100%.
Yeah. There's just the feeling of being caught off guard
Yeah.
is enough to kind of derail you.
Yeah. Even if you expected the other crew to launch air.
Yeah.
And I
Hearing
just
them
wanna,
do it and thinking that that patient was perfectly
That's
stable.
what I was like, what happened?
Mhm.
What happened?
But I think another perspective is if you, let's say you did fly the kid, if you heard that crew get back on the radio and request air for their
They wouldn't
patient,
have had, yeah.
they wouldn't have had an aircraft. And that would have also been a terrible feeling to hear a 30-minute ETA.
I just stole their aircraft.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you have been like, man, this kid actually probably could have gone by ground. Did I just freak out and fly them when maybe the helicopter would have been better used
Right.
elsewhere?
Yeah.
Yeah, managing resources is a tough thing that we have to think about because although we are not a very rural county, we have rural aspects of our county. We're kind of a rural urban mix, but we are not, parts of our county are very close to definitive care and trauma centers. We have to balance resource utilization because there are counties that surround us that are very rural. And so if I call for a helicopter, I have to be okay with knowing that somebody that has a trauma 2 hours away in a county that has a 2-hour transport may not have access to air. So I like, sometimes I really have to weigh that, like, do I absolutely need them?
Yeah.
Because I feel like we have a responsibility to the surrounding
Right.
populations to not set them up for failure.
And the good news is most of those places have their own aircraft, but
Yes.
we're like their backup aircraft,
Yes.
which is important.
Yeah.
It's still very important. I just want to be very clear. I do not blame fire. I agree that that patient probably, based on what I've spoken with our providers, supervisor, the initial crew that established care for that patient, that he was stable for them. So I don't think it was their fault either. It was just a bad situation.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a comment on the provider
Right.
that told you they were stable. It's more just the question.
Like, what if I
Because
just
you
would've
didn't
checked?
do your
Yeah.
own. Like maybe there was a sign that you noticed that they didn't notice.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think we've all had that before.
Comments to the peanut gallery? Any advice?
To be unclear is to be unkind. ABCs, but also make it make sense. And make sure you assess every patient on your scene within reason.
To wrap things up, I just want to remind you that all of these cases have been QA'd and that it was deemed that all interventions were appropriate. So that concludes our episode for this week. We will see you next week with our fireside chat. And don't forget to follow us on our socials, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a few others if you check out our RSS feed. And everything is linked in our link tree. So stay safe. We'll see you next time.
This has been Life in Sirens, produced by 3 nerds trying to bring you content that you might actually care about.